Hello, my name is Tessa Asquith-Lamb and I'm an artist. I work at the City Arts Centre and other venues, running workshops and also leading Describe tours for the visually impaired. In my first video today, I'm going to be talking about elements of style in 1920s paintings. The first painting I've chosen to talk about, though, is from a little earlier. It's from 1914 and it's Francis Caddell's The Black Hat. This painting shows a model that Caddell frequently used who had the name Bersha Don Warkop. She's modelling here for him, standing before a fireplace with one hand on her hip in a very confident pose, looking straight at the viewer. The dress she's wearing is a kind of almondy, yellow coloured silk, quite loose bodiced dress, which is typical of the period. It would be underpinned by a very long line corset, which would give the figure a kind of S-shape bent to it, very elongated and long, but quite full in the front. This was the style at the time. And this is what was about to change greatly in the 1920s, this idea of what was the ideal sort of body shape. She's wearing lace trim, which again was very fashionable at the time, and in her hand she's holding what looks like a fan. Again, no woman was really sort of fully dressed when they went out without a fan. It was such a common accessory to have. She's wearing on the front of her dress a corsage of flowers. These might have been silk or fresh. There was a huge trade in making artificial flowers throughout the 19th century and into the 20th century. And many of these survive today, preserved in wedding bouquets or on wedding dresses. Her hat's especially interesting. Hats in the Edwardian era, slightly earlier than this, had been enormous and, huge brimmed hats, and they would be supported by your hair being padded out with sort of fake hair pads called rats, which were put underneath your actual hair, and then your actual hair was pulled over the top and pinned like this into these enormous Edwardian hairstyles. But this lady's wearing a hat which is much closer to her head, and it sort of is the beginnings of that style that in the 1920s would become the cloche hat, this close-fitting hat. But this seems to be something that actually just was in fashion in about 1914. And also in fashion are these little feathers that are sticking out the side of her hat. It was common to have one feather up one way and one at an angle. And again, this is quite different. Previously, Edwardian hats had huge swooshing feathers that kind of flipped around the hats. So she's a very modern woman. She's wearing gold hoop earrings, and there's a sense that she's wearing lipstick, which again is quite dramatic for that time. Makeup's only just really becoming an acceptable thing for women to be wearing. She's standing against this fireplace, and on the fireplace mantelpiece there's a candlestick and what looks like a pink and white teapot or a vase and a blue and white vase. And these are reflected in the mirror, and these are fashionable, beautiful ceramics and antiques that a fashionable interior would have at the time. The style it's painted in is very feathery and loose, and it owes a lot to Whistler. The way it's painted would change hugely in the 1920s. Caddell's style became much more flattened, in keeping with how everybody's style sort of seemed to take on this idea in the 1920s of flattening everything and crisping up the edges slightly. But at this stage, everything's much more feathery and light. She's wearing long gloves on her hands. Again, ladies really sort of didn't stop wearing gloves till the kind of 1960s. These would have been elbow-length gloves, kid gloves, which needed stretching before they were put on. You would put special powder down the end of the gloves and then insert glove stretchers down the fingers to stretch them out before you put them on. And it was seen as being really kind of important as a fashionable woman to have really well-fitting gloves that buckled or pinned with little buttons down the sides. So it's all about to change after this painting, and women's style is really going to change, as we'll see in the next paintings. The next painting we're going to look at is Stanley Curtiter's The Fair Isle Jumper, painted in 1923. Although the pose of the model in this painting, Roberta Farquharson, is very much similar to that of Caddell's model in The Black Hat, with one hand on her hip looking directly out at the viewer, this is a woman dressed for a very different life. After the First World War, women's lives had changed completely, and the roles they took in society had changed as well, and they were leading much more active lives. The woman in this painting is wearing a Fair Isle jumper and a Fair Isle fisherman's cap or cap. They are worked all over with a beautiful geometric design of red and blue patterns. And the cap itself has a band of this patterning and then a plain top, and then the side of it has little pom-poms that fall down and sort of form a feature just by her ear, and you can imagine them really arranging that really carefully before they started modelling for this picture. The scarf she's wearing feels like this beautiful kind of soft blue wool and is there to give her extra warmth rather than put a coat over that beautiful jumper. She looks like she's maybe dressed for golf or going out for a walk. One interesting fact about this painting is that the jumper that's in the picture actually survives in the National Museum of Scotland to this day. The Fair Isle jumper itself was very, very fashionable at this time, having been worn by Edward, Prince of Wales, as part of his natty golfing attire in St Andrews in 1922. And what she's wearing is really, really fashionable for the time. You notice she's still wearing gloves. Again, no woman would really sort of go out without wearing gloves. They were seen as a kind of just a general purpose, everyday piece of wear that everybody would be wearing, really. But these are shorter gloves. They're not these really sort of long elbow length gloves, which were still worn in the evenings. She's got closely cut bobbed hair. Again, this is another sign of her being a modern woman. Closely cut bobbed hair, or even shorter shingled or Eton cropped hair, was seen as one of the sort of signposts of modernity at that time. Not every woman went down this route. Some women would just sort of coil their hair up at the sides. The next painting we're going to look at is called Villa Gotta Garden, painted by John Duncan Ferguson, one of the Scottish colourists, in around 1920. It shows a young woman standing in a garden background. The angular diagonal forms of the leaves in the garden form a fantastic backdrop to her really strong profile face. She's got very beautiful angular bobbed hair, and around her hair there's a beautiful kind of floral headband. It's definitely not the kind of headband that you'd wear every day. It's more associated with theatrical costume or dance, which is interesting because Margaret Morris, John Duncan Ferguson's partner, ran a dance school at Cap d'Antibes in the grounds of a chateau there. So maybe this woman is dressed for a dance routine. She feels like almost like a spirit of the age, a spirit of this kind of forward-facing modernity with a strong profile in this beautiful sunlit land. Rest Time in the Life class was painted by Dorothy Johnson in 1923. It shows the model Poppy Lowe relaxing in between posing and modelling for a life class. The life class itself is being taught by the artist. She's shown herself in the back right hand corner next to an easel, talking to some students about their life drawings. The students in the foreground are Kate Price and Belle Kilgour, and they are looking at one of their drawings. The figure on the right holds a stick of charcoal, and by looking at the drawing we can see that the pose that the model has been taking has been much more upright. Holding a pose for a long time is very difficult, and models get quite a good wage to be able to hold their poses for that kind of length of time, because sometimes a pose could take maybe half an hour or more. If you've ever tried to stay still for that long, it's very, very difficult. In the background there are further students who are busy talking to each other, maybe about their drawings, maybe not. It's a painting about life in an art room, and it's a painting about how things are changing as well. These students are all female. Attending a life class like this would have been probably unheard of in the 19th century, especially not a mixed class. But this is an all-female class. It was thought to be a little bit morally problematic to have a kind of mixed class. So this is a very forward-thinking group of young artists. The teacher herself, Dorothy Johnson, had become a star pupil at Edinburgh College of Art when she joined at just 16. She later went on to marry her fellow artist D.M. Sutherland in 1924. Unfortunately, due to a law called the marriage bar, this meant that she couldn't keep her full-time teaching position, but she did carry on exhibiting under her own name. The women in this picture, apart from being very modern in their outlook of being, artists in their own right, fledgling artists, are all wearing very practical clothes. They're wearing linen shirts, pinafores, they have closely cropped modern hair, or a few of them have a hairstyle which was known as shells, where you coil your hair at the side of your head, a bit like headphones, which is an alternative to cropping your hair. But they're really part of the kind of vanguard of what would become the next generation of female artists. It really reminds me of being back at Edinburgh College of Art myself. I was a student there in the 1990s, and it reminds me of my friends and I in the life class talking to each other. Although what used to happen mostly was if the model was having a break, they would put their dressing gown and rush off and get a cup of tea. They wouldn't sort of just sit in the middle of the life class. The final painting we're going to look at is Maul's Corner After Rain, painted by Robert Easton Stewart in 1925. It shows a rainy corner of Edinburgh. We are looking out from the doorway of the Caledonian Station, from what is now the Caledonian Hotel, towards Maul's Corner, where Maul's department store stood on the corner of the street and looking towards the entrance to Charlotte Square. There was a common saying at the time, "Meet me at Maul's," which was a kind of bit of a sort of slogan and really caught on because people would meet on the corner of that street, often for dates. The people scurrying about in the rainy streets are reflected on the wet ground. There are men in hats and women in long warm coats with close hats pulled down around their ears. These are just ordinary people going about their everyday lives. And this is the ordinary side of fashion. And yet these people will have aspired to own fashionable items, and more mass-produced objects meant that fashion was in the reach of many. I thought it'd be nice to look at a few items from my collection, which these women in the painting might have aspired to own or been able to afford. This is a little evening bag with a lovely sort of jewelled clasp, not real jewels. Inside, when I open it, there's a little purse which opens up inside. So it's a very sort of practical little bag that you might take on an evening out. It's got sort of ruching around here. Very pretty. The other thing that screams the 1920s to me is this. This is a belt buckle made out of plastic with a metal back, and plastics were becoming more useful and more used then. It looks a bit like fake tortoiseshell, and then it's got a kind of fake jewel in the middle. And what is interesting about this is it's in the Egyptian style, and this became really, really popular after the discovery of King Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922. Anything with an Egyptian head on it would have been very fashionable, so this belt buckle will have marked you out as being really on trend. The last object I'd like to show you is this. This is a little Art Deco compact. Compacts are usually round, so this kind of angular, very futuristic shaped metal compact is really of its time. It has this beautiful Art Deco pattern on the front, and I'll just show you how it works. This side is the powder, and you've got a mirror there, and the modern woman would have also bought her own cigarettes. Very un-PC now, but that side's for your cigarettes. And then, most brilliant of all, up at the top here is a lipstick which pulls out and has got in it still its original lipstick. Let's pop that back in. To me, that really speaks of the kind of modernity. Everything's very modern and unfussy, and it's all there in one kind of object to carry around. So I like to think some of the people in that painting might have owned objects a bit like these. We've seen through the paintings we've looked at today just how varied the styles of the 1920s could be, but how they all pointed towards a kind of future of kind of modernity and people wanting to change the things of the past and become much more modern and forward thinking in their looks and styles. So I hope you've enjoyed looking through these paintings with me today.